There's a building on Fremont Street in downtown Las Vegas that's still there if you want to go find it. It's called Binion's now. Just Binion's. No Horseshoe, no family name above that. The neon horseshoe that used to blaze above the entrance is gone. You can find it at the Neon Museum out on Las Vegas Boulevard, propped in the desert air among the other signs of places that don't exist anymore. It keeps company with the Stardust, the Sands, the Moulin Rouge. Inside the building today, slot machines calibrated to yield, a bar called Whiskey Liquor Up Saloon with retractable windows and a rotating floor, hotel rooms decorated in vintage style by people who weren't there. What's missing is harder to describe. The carpet used to be red, deep red, worn to a specific texture after decades of feet, the fibers ground down by 1,000 nights of men who knew what they were doing and came here to do it. The ceilings were low, the walls were velvet. In the center of the casino floor, under glass in a horseshoe-shaped case, there used to be $1 million in cash, $110,000 bills stacked and fanned and lit like an altar. People lined up daily to stand in front of it and have their photograph taken. Not because they thought they'd win it, just because they wanted to stand near the proof that a place this serious existed. That display is gone. A woman named Becky sold it to a collector sometime around the year 2000. The collectors and the corporates and the federal marshals, they all came eventually. And when they left, they took most of what mattered with them. This is the story of how a family that survived gangsters and bombers and Leavenworth Federal Prison, a family that built the most profitable casino in Las Vegas and invented the World Series of Poker, managed, across one catastrophic generation, to lose everything. It involves a murder that may or may not have been a murder. A stripper and her boyfriend with a shovel, 6 tons of silver buried in the Nevada desert. And on a January night in 2004, a posse of armed US Marshals who walked through the front door of an American institution and walked back out with the last $1 million. But before all that, before the drugs and the lawyers and the vault in the desert, there was a man in a cowboy hat who drove to Las Vegas in 1946 with suitcases full of cash and an idea about how a casino ought to be run. His name was Benny Binion, and he was the most dangerous man anyone in Dallas had ever met. We tell the stories of what America built and how it fell apart. If that's your thing, subscribe. More of these are coming. Now let's get back to the story. He was born Lester Ben Binion in 1904 in a small Texas town called Pilot Grove, close enough to Dallas to see its lights, far enough from anything to understand that the world beyond didn't particularly care whether you lived or died. His parents kept him out of school. He was sickly as a boy, too fragile, they thought, for classrooms. So his father, a horse trader, took him along instead, out onto the trade circuits of rural Texas, sleeping in campgrounds, watching men haggle over livestock of deliberately obscured quality. That was his curriculum. Cheating and not being cheated. Reading men instead of books. He would be in his 50s, serving time in federal prison, before he learned to read in the traditional sense. What he learned instead, he never forgot. The horse traders gambled in their camps, poker, dice, whatever was available. The young Benny watched them, absorbed everything, the odds, the tells, the rhythm of money moving between men. By the time he was a teenager, he understood something that most people spend their whole lives missing, that gambling wasn't luck, it was information, and information was power. By 18, he was in El Paso, bootlegging during Prohibition. He moved to Dallas a year later and kept going, moonshining, numbers running, dice games at downtown hotels. He built a numbers operation in Deep Ellum, the old black neighborhood on the east side of Dallas. And by 1928, he had expanded it into something that would eventually control the entire city. He was generous, in the way that men who need loyalty tend to be. At Christmas, the Binion gang passed out turkeys to regular customers. He paid the cops. He paid the politicians. He paid whoever needed paying. And in exchange, Dallas looked the other way while Benny Binion turned the city's underground economy into his personal property. But he was also dangerous, genuinely, casually dangerous, in a way that the word barely captures now. In 1931, a rum runner named Frank Bolding came into Benny's backyard with a knife. Benny tipped backward off a crate, came up with a pistol, and shot Bolding dead. He turned himself in, pled guilty, walked out with a 2-year suspended sentence and a nickname, the Cowboy. In 1936, a rival racketeer named Ben Frieden was sitting in his parked car on Allen Street. Benny approached on foot, emptied his pistol into Frieden through the window, then allegedly shot himself in the shoulder and claimed self-defense. The district attorney declined to prosecute. Years later, someone asked Benny if he'd bribed the DA. "Well, I don't know," he said. "Maybe I had." By the early 1940s, The FBI reported that Binion's interests had complete control of all rackets in the Dallas area during the war years. He was the king of a city. He operated with a philosophy that he stated plainly, without apology, throughout his life. Do your enemies before they do you. He believed that. He lived it. And it worked for a while, until the wrong man got elected sheriff of Dallas County in 1946, and Benny's political protection evaporated overnight. He packed suitcases with cash, loaded his wife Teddy Jane and their 5 children into cars, and headed west for Las Vegas, Nevada, a place where gambling was legal, the desert was wide, and a man with money and a certain reputation could start over. He was 42 years old. He wore a white 10-gallon Stetson and cowboy shirts with gold coin buttons. He spit on floors and meant it. He had never read a book. He had killed at least 2 men and ordered the deaths of others. And he was about to build one of the most beloved casinos in the history of American gambling. The contradiction was the point. Benny Binion was not a complicated man who occasionally did terrible things. He was a man whose specific experience of violence, of loyalty, of what it meant to treat a customer right, produced an institution that could not have been built any other way. You could not manufacture what he created. You could only stumble into it from Dallas with blood on your hands and a vision for what a casino ought to feel like. Las Vegas, when Benny arrived, was still mostly a highway town with a gambling habit. The Strip was beginning to emerge. The Flamingo had opened under Bugsy Siegel the year before, and the mob was starting to understand what the desert could be. Downtown, Fremont Street buzzed with casinos that locals called Glitter Gulch, neon signs shouting into the warm air, the Golden Nugget, the Pioneer Club, the El Cortez. Benny had arrived with enough cash to buy his way in. He became a partner at the Las Vegas club, left after licensing disputes, opened the Westerner gambling house, sold out after conflicts with partners. He spent 2 years moving sideways through a city that hadn't quite decided what to make of him. Then, in May of 1951, he bought the El Dorado Club and the old Apache Hotel on Fremont Street. He invested $350,000 in renovations. His attorney stood before the State Gaming Commission and argued his case. The chips arrived from the manufacturer stamped Binions in gold before the license was even approved. On August 14, 1951, the Horseshoe Club opened its doors. It was unlike anything on Fremont Street, unlike anything in Las Vegas, possibly unlike anything in the history of American gambling. The floor was carpeted, the first casino in downtown Las Vegas to replace the traditional sawdust with carpet. He installed air conditioning at a time when other casino operators hadn't bothered. He dispatched limousines to the airport to bring players in. He gave free drinks to everybody, not just the high rollers, everybody, at a time when complimentary drinks were strictly reserved for big money. And then there was the gambling itself. Other casinos set craps table limits at $50. Benny set his at $500, 10 times higher than anyone else. Then he went further. A player's first bet, whatever it was, became their table limit for all subsequent bets, which meant that a gambler could walk in off Fremont Street, put $1 million on the pass line, and the Horseshoe would cover it. No one else in Las Vegas would do that. No one else in America would do that. Benny got death threats from other casino owners for undercutting their limits. He ignored them. He understood something that the corporate operators would spend decades trying to reverse engineer. A real gambler doesn't want spectacle, doesn't want a showgirl or a comedian or a fancy restaurant, wants a fair game, a high limit, and to be treated like a human being, regardless of how much money is in his pocket. Benny gave them all 3. He said it himself, in words that became a kind of operating philosophy for the Horseshoe. Good food, good whiskey cheap, and a good gamble. That was it. That was the whole thing. The Horseshoe grew the way a fire grows when you stop trying to contain it. By 1953, Benny's legal past had caught up with him. Tax evasion charges, an FBI investigation, the Senate's Kefauver Committee investigating organized crime in American cities. He pled guilty to federal tax evasion and state charges, received a 5-year sentence at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, and paid $776,000 in back taxes, penalties, and interest. To cover it, he sold the majority interest in the Horseshoe to a New Orleans oilman named Joe W. Brown. The Horseshoe kept running. It didn't miss a beat. While Brown operated it, he installed something that would define the casino's identity for the next 5 decades. A glass case in the shape of a horseshoe on the casino floor containing $1 million in $10,000 bills, 100 of them, fanned and stacked behind the glass like evidence of something. Tourists who had no intention of gambling, people who had come to Las Vegas for the shows and the hotel pools, detoured to Fremont Street to stand in front of that case and have their picture taken. It was the most effective marketing in the history of downtown Las Vegas, and it cost nothing but the opportunity cost of $1 million sitting in a display case instead of on the floor. Benny served 3 years and 3 months at Leavenworth. He came out in 1957. The family had bought back controlling interest during his incarceration. By 1964, they were the sole owners again. Jack, now 27, and Ted, 21, licensed as the operators, because Benny, as a convicted felon, would never hold a gaming license in Nevada again. He went on the payroll as director of public relations. Everyone knew who ran the show. The 1960s were expansion years. The neighboring Boulder Club was absorbed in 1960. The casino grew. The reputation grew faster. Gamblers who understood the game, who wanted no-limit craps, 100 times odds, the kind of action that made the strip casinos look timid, came to Fremont Street specifically for the Horseshoe. A Texan who'd heard about it from a friend at a cattle auction would drive to Las Vegas, walk past the Sahara and the Desert Inn, and keep going downtown. The Horseshoe was what he came for. Then in 1970, Benny Binion had an idea. In January of 1949, he'd arranged for 2 poker legends, Johnny Moss and Nick the Greek Dandalos, to play a heads-up match in his casino. It ran for 5 months. Dandalos ultimately lost somewhere between $2 and $4 million. When it was over, he said in one of the most famous lines in gambling history, "Mr. Moss, I have to let you go." The match had drawn enormous attention, gamblers coming from across the country just to watch. Benny remembered that, remembered what it meant to put the world's best players in a room and let people watch. In 1970, he invited 7 of the best-known poker players in the world to the Horseshoe for a tournament. Johnny Moss was there, Doyle Brunson, tall, soft-spoken, with a game that nobody had ever seen the likes of, Puggy Pearson, Amarillo Slim Preston. They played no-limit Texas Hold'em, and afterward they voted on who was the best all-around player. Moss won. He received a silver cup. Benny told Doyle Brunson afterward, "You know, Doyle, someday we may have 100 people in this tournament." He had no idea. What began as a small gathering in a low-ceilinged room on Fremont Street became, in the years that followed, the most prestigious poker event on Earth. The World Series of Poker grew slowly, 52 players by 1982, then satellite tournaments, then national television coverage. By 1987, more than 2,100 players competed across all events. By 1991, the main event's first prize hit $1 million for the first time. The Poker Hall of Fame opened on-site in 1979. Portraits of legends mounted on the walls of the casino. Photographs of men who'd built the game staring down at the current generation trying to measure up. The champion's photograph from each main event joined the gallery. By the 1990s, that wall in Binion's was the closest thing poker had to Cooperstown, a record of achievement that existed nowhere else, in no other building, on no other street in the world. The WSOP made the Horseshoe something it had always been in spirit, but could now claim outright, the center of the gambling universe. In 1988, the Binion sons bought the adjacent Mint Hotel, a high-rise tower that doubled the size of the operation. The expanded casino now covered an entire city block of Fremont Street. A dedicated poker room opened for the first time. A bronze statue of the young Benny on horseback, tribute to a cowboy, was erected outside, the city's acknowledgement that this man, murderer and bootlegger and visionary, had built something that mattered. What Benny had started in that low-ceilinged room in 1951 was now, by 1988, an empire with the World Series of Poker as its crown jewel, a poker room that hosted the sport's annual championship and a reputation that reached further than any neon sign. Benny died on Christmas Day, 1989. He was 85. His family was there. His name was above the door. The World Series of Poker was booked for the following spring. He died believing, with every reason to believe, that he'd built something that would outlast him. To understand what was lost, you have to feel it first. Walk through those doors on a Thursday night in the late 1980s. Not the main entrance on Fremont Street with the neon blasting overhead and the tourists pointing their cameras. Go around, through the side entrance, into the heart of the place. The ceilings are low. That's the first thing you notice. After the strip casinos with their engineered sightlines and their soaring atria designed to make you feel like you've entered a cathedral of commerce, the Horseshoe feels intimate isn't quite right. It feels compressed, close, like the room is leaning in to hear what you're saying. Red carpet underfoot, worn but present. Velvet on the walls in dark colors. The steer horns above certain doorways. Emerald green ceilings painted that way by Teddy Jane Binion, who had opinions about what a casino should look like and the authority to act on them. The sound is specific, not the engineered acoustic wash of a modern casino floor, not the carefully calculated noise designed to create a feeling of energy without ever crossing into discomfort. The Horseshoe sounds like what it is, a room full of people who came here to gamble, the crack of cards, the rattle of chips on felt, the low, concentrated murmur of men making decisions about money, occasional laughter, sharp and genuine. Somewhere, the click and tumble of dice hitting the back wall of a craps table, and underneath all of it, a hum, not mechanical, human, the particular frequency of a room where something real is at stake. The craps tables are crowded. They always are. This is where Benny's philosophy lives in its purest form. No limit means no limit, and there are people at these tables who came from Texas and Oklahoma and parts of Nevada nobody else could find on a map specifically to stand here, in this room, and bet a number that would make a strip pit boss sweat through his jacket. The dealers know their regulars. Not the way a hotel front desk knows a guest's name from a file. The way a person knows somebody they've stood across from for years, in the same spot, watching the same game. Go past the craps tables toward the back, the poker room. After 1988, it has its own dedicated space, tables arranged in the particular order of a room that takes itself seriously. This is where the World Series of Poker happens each spring, where the final table is assembled and the champions are made. But on a regular Thursday night, it's something better than that. It's a working poker room, full of working poker players, some of them legends, and some of them just good. All of them here because there is no better place in the world to play this game. The Poker Hall of Fame is on the wall, portraits of Johnny Moss and Doyle Brunson and Stu Ungar, who won the main event in 1980 and 1981, and would come back in 1997, broke and desperate, to win it a third time, completing one of the most extraordinary comebacks in the history of any sport. Their faces look down at the current generation with the particular expression of men who know exactly what this room cost them and exactly what it gave them back. The $1 million display is up front, near the entrance, under glass. $110,000 bills arranged in the shape of a horseshoe. The light hits the bills in a way that makes them look almost warm, almost alive. Tourists pose in front of it daily. It is the visual proof of Benny's promise that whatever you bring in here, this place can match it. Now find the back corner of the casino, the restaurant. The menu is simple. The most famous item, a steak, available late at night for $2. The beef comes from Benny's own cattle ranches in Montana. He had accumulated more than 85,000 acres by the time he died, raising the animals himself, trucking the meat down to feed the people who gambled in his casino. At 2 a.m., when the strip has gone quiet and the carpet on the horseshoe floor has absorbed another night's worth of cigarette smoke and spilled drinks and the specific nervous energy of men who have just won or just lost, you can sit in that corner and eat a real steak for $2. That was the horseshoe, not glamorous, not spectacular, something better than both. The people who worked here had a word for what they were. They were horseshoe people, not casino workers, not hospitality employees. Horseshoe people, a specific category with specific standards that existed in no other building in Las Vegas and could not be replicated elsewhere. A dealer who had worked the horseshoe's craps tables for 15 years didn't just know the game. He knew the regulars, knew which ones tipped and which ones didn't, which ones would press their luck past rational behavior, and which ones had iron discipline, which ones were celebrating and which ones were trying to win back something they'd already lost. He had the particular education of someone who has stood in the same spot for years, watching the same human drama play out across a felt table. The casino employed more than 800 people at its peak. They came from the neighborhoods around downtown Las Vegas, from the working-class streets where casino employees had always lived, from families where a job at the Horseshoe meant something specific, stability, a pension, the pride of working in the most serious gambling establishment in America. Ted Binion was there most nights during peak hours. He wore boots and a cowboy hat, like his father. He carried a pistol tucked into his jeans, like his father. He drove a pickup with his dog, Princess, riding shotgun. He was warm with the regulars and warmer with the dealers, a man who genuinely loved the casino floor, who had grown up on it, who knew every game and every table and every face. He hosted the poker tournaments with an enthusiasm that wasn't performance. He simply loved poker. He loved the casino. He loved being a Binion in the place the Binions had built. Jack ran the business. Teddy Jane kept the books. Ted was the soul of the floor, and the floor ran, and the players came, and the World Series of Poker grew, and the poker room filled, and the craps tables hummed with the sound of real money being wagered on real odds. And for a while, for a good long while, it seemed like nothing could touch the Horseshoe. Downtown Las Vegas's identity through the 1970s and into the 1980s was inseparable from the Horseshoe. Fremont Street, Glitter Gulch, existed in a particular relationship with the casino that anchored its most famous block. The other downtown properties organized themselves around it. When the World Series of Poker was in session each spring, the entire neighborhood oriented toward the Horseshoe's poker room, bars and restaurants filled with players and railbirds. Hotels on Fremont Street ran at capacity. The tournament brought gamblers from Europe and Asia and South America, people who had come to Las Vegas specifically for this, specifically here, and who would spend their money in the surrounding blocks while they waited for their seat at the table. Cowboys filled the casino every December during the National Finals Rodeo, which Benny himself had helped bring to Las Vegas. He paid the entry fees for all competing cowboys out of his own pocket every year. After he died, Boyd Gaming continued the tradition. The Horseshoe was the logical place for the cowboys to gather. It felt like where they belonged, in a city of themed spectacle, the one place that felt authentically like the Old West it was pretending to be. The Horseshoe's claim to dominance was never formally published. The casino was privately held, unlike the Strip resorts, which traded on stock exchanges and filed earnings reports. The Horseshoe never had to show anyone its numbers. But among people who knew the business, the reputation was settled. The Horseshoe was the most profitable casino in Las Vegas. For decades, year after year, in a building without fountains or volcanoes or headline entertainers, Benny Binion's casino out-earned the spectacles. Good food, good whiskey cheap, and a good gamble. It was enough. For a very long time, it was more than enough. By the late 1980s, Binion's Horseshoe had reached something that empires rarely achieve, the feeling of permanence. The numbers told part of the story. After the 1988 Mint acquisition, the casino covered an entire city block of Fremont Street. The poker room was the home of the most prestigious tournament on earth. The WSOP was growing. 1987 had brought more than 2,100 players across all events. The 1989 main event champion was Phil Hellmuth, 24 years old, who would go on to become the most decorated tournament player in poker history. He raised his bracelet in this room. This was where records were made. Benny Binion died on Christmas Day, 1989, at 85, of heart failure. He died in Las Vegas, in the city he had chosen, at 42, with his family around him and his name above the door and the World Series of Poker scheduled for the following April. He had been convicted of murder and done time in Leavenworth. He had been a bootlegger, a numbers runner, the boss of Dallas's criminal underworld, and he had, improbably, become what the mayor of Las Vegas would one day call a civic treasure. An arena sang happy birthday to him when he was 83. Willie Nelson was there. Gene Autry was there. 18,000 people chanted his name. He had spent 40 years remaking himself in the desert, not apologizing for Dallas exactly, but building something genuine enough that the question of Dallas became secondary. You could disagree with everything Benny Binion had done to survive and still walk into his casino and feel that he had built something honest. The game was real. The odds were real. The no-limit policy was real. In a city built on the careful calibration of the house edge, the Horseshoe was the one place that bet on itself by letting you bet on yourself. After Benny's death, Teddy Jane, his wife of decades, the woman who had kept the books and held the operation together through Leavenworth and the mob and the family disputes, remained the quiet center of the institution. Jack ran the president's office. Ted ran the floor. The machine kept running. But something had changed, not in the casino, in the city around it. 1989 was the year Steve Wynn opened the Mirage on the Strip, the most expensive casino hotel in history, $630 million, a volcano that erupted every 15 minutes out front, a white tiger habitat, a massive atrium with a rainforest. The Strip was beginning to transform itself into something the Horseshoe had never needed to be, a destination for people who weren't primarily there to gamble. The Mirage worked. It worked beyond anyone's projections, and it began a decade of construction on the Strip that would fundamentally reshape what Las Vegas meant to the American tourist. Standing inside the Horseshoe in 1989, with the craps tables full and the poker room preparing for another World Series, none of that felt threatening. The regulars weren't going to the Mirage. The serious gamblers weren't abandoning Fremont Street for a volcano show. The Horseshoe had its people. It had always had its people. But Teddy Jane Binion was aging. Jack Binion was building out-of-state properties. Ted Binion, whose drug use the floor staff could detect by the smell drifting down from the security cameras, was losing his battle with the Nevada Gaming Control Board, who had been watching him since 1986. The machine was still running. Nobody had looked at the engine in a while. What happens inside a place like this when the people who built it are gone and the people who inherited it can't agree on what it was for? When the son who loved the floor loses access to the floor? When the daughter who gets the keys was never supposed to have them? The Horseshoe was at its summit in 1989, the highest point before everything changed. They just didn't know it yet. Teddy Jane Binion died in 1994. She had been for 40 years, the one thing Benny never talked about in his philosophy of good food, good whiskey cheap, and a good gamble. The person who kept the books, who made sure the numbers worked, who was the quiet axis around which the entire Binion operation rotated. Benny was the vision and the brand and the terror when necessary. Teddy Jane was the institution. The casino ran because she kept it running. When she was gone, the vacuum was immediate, and into that vacuum poured 5 decades of suppressed family tension that the presence of 2 commanding personalities, Benny and Teddy Jane, had been quietly holding at bay. Jack Binion had spent the previous decade building out. He had started Horseshoe Gaming Holdings, a separate company carrying the Horseshoe name, to riverboat casinos in Indiana, Louisiana, and Mississippi. It was legitimate, it was profitable, and it meant that Jack's attention increasingly was in Tunica and Hammond rather than on Fremont Street. He was president of the Las Vegas Horseshoe in title. In practice, he was running an empire that extended across the Mississippi Valley. His youngest sister, Becky, noticed. In January 1996, Becky Binion filed suit against Jack in district court, alleging mismanagement, that Jack was using the Horseshoe's resources and reputation while directing his energy and expertise toward his own outside properties. The suit was bitter, and it was public. A judge ordered them to operate as co-presidents, requiring unanimous agreement on major decisions requiring unanimous agreement between 2 siblings who had just sued each other. The deadlock ran for nearly 2 years. During that period, according to court filings, the Horseshoe suffered losses of $20 million in a single fiscal year. A casino that had been, for decades, the most profitable privately held property in Las Vegas was hemorrhaging money, not because the market had turned, not because the games were bad, but because the family couldn't agree on anything. Meanwhile, the city was changing in ways the Horseshoe hadn't needed to worry about since 1951. The Strip had gone to war against itself in the most spectacular arms race American entertainment had ever seen. The Mirage in 1989, Excalibur in 1990, the MGM Grand in 1993, the largest hotel in the world, Treasure Island, the Monte Carlo, New York. Then, in 1998, the Bellagio, $2 billion of Italian marble and dancing fountains, and a gallery of fine art in the Nevada desert, each one larger than the last, each one pulling the gravitational center of Las Vegas further from Fremont Street and further from the identity the Horseshoe had spent 50 years perfecting. The tourists, the casual visitors, the people who came to Las Vegas for a long weekend and wanted to say they had experienced it, went to the Strip. Of course they did. The Strip had engineered itself for their pleasure. The Horseshoe had never tried. Benny's philosophy had always been for the people who knew what they wanted. But the people who knew what they wanted turned out to be a market with edges, and those edges were tightening. Downtown tried to fight back. In 1995, the remaining Fremont Street casino operators pooled resources to install the Fremont Street experience, a canopy over the pedestrian mall, embedded with millions of LED lights, running light shows overhead every hour. It brought foot traffic. It brought tourists who had walked the Strip and wanted to see old Vegas. But it also transformed the neighborhood into something approximating a theme park version of itself. Potted palms and kiosks selling t-shirts where the unsanitized electricity of Glitter Gulch had been. Benny Binion, who had built a casino specifically because he believed a real gambler didn't want spectacle, would not have recognized the street his casino sat on. And through all of this, Ted Binion was getting worse. He had been arrested on drug trafficking charges in 1986. He had drawn attention for his association with Herbert "Fat Herbie" Blitzstein, a top lieutenant of the Chicago outfit, killed gangland style in January 1997. Floor staff at the Horseshoe could tell when Ted was monitoring the casino from the security cameras by the smell of marijuana smoke drifting through the system. The Nevada Gaming Control Board had been watching him since the mid-1980s. In 1996, they provisionally banned him from any management role and ordered regular drug testing. Ted shaved every hair off his body to try to beat a hair follicle test. That's how badly he needed to stay connected to the one thing that had always defined him. It didn't work. In May 1997, his license was suspended after he violated the drug testing agreement. On March 24, 1998, the Nevada Gaming Commission voted 4-0 to revoke his license permanently. The specific charge, his sustained association with Blitzstein and other figures connected to organized crime. "I think we should send a clear message to the industry," said Commissioner Augie Garola that day, "that we just don't like associating with notorious or unsavory characters." Ted Binion sat in that hearing room and said, "It's not the end of the world." He was wrong. When Ted lost his license, he had to sell his 20% stake in the Horseshoe. He sold it to Becky, At roughly the same time, the prolonged legal battle between Becky and Jack reached its resolution. Jack sold his 42% to Becky as well for a reported $20 million, retaining 1% interest to preserve his Nevada gaming license. Becky Binion became the sole owner of Binion's Horseshoe. She wanted, genuinely, to restore what her father had built. She said so publicly at her Gaming Commission hearing. She was looking forward to getting the business of the Horseshoe back to the way it was when I was being raised. There is no reason to doubt that she meant it. But Becky was not Jack. She was not Benny. She was not Teddy Jane. And her husband, Nick Binion, had been denied a gaming license in 1978 and was legally prohibited from any management role in the casino. Everyone who was there agrees that Nick ran things anyway. Behind the scenes, from the edges of decisions, the way Benny himself had operated after his own license was stripped in the 1950s. The difference, as one account put it plainly, is that Benny had run things brilliantly. Nick Binion ran things poorly. The cost-cutting that followed wasn't malicious, it was panic economics, the decisions of people who could see the revenue declining and reached for the levers they could control. The million-dollar display was sold to a private collector named Jay Perino, the glass horseshoe case that had stood on the casino floor since the 1960s, that generations of tourists had photographed themselves in front of. That was the single most recognizable visual symbol of the Horseshoe's identity. Gone. Becky needed the money, and it was an asset that was just sitting there. A popular restaurant that Benny had used as his personal office was closed. The World Series of Poker's entry fee distribution was restructured in ways that alienated the dealers who had worked those tournaments for decades. Cost-cutting on staffing and maintenance transformed the Horseshoe's carefully worn authenticity into something that simply looked old and tired. The carpet, for which Benny had once been revolutionary, which had come to define the Horseshoe's particular texture, was, as one longtime visitor described it, duct tape patched. 1/3 of the slot machines were empty most of the time. Each decision had a logic. The display was capital sitting idle. The restaurant was a cost center. The staffing reductions were line items. What the logic couldn't show was what those things meant. That the display was the promise. That the restaurant was the history. That the staffing was the culture. Strip away the things that made it the Horseshoe, and you weren't saving the Horseshoe. You were dismantling it to pay for the room it was dismantled in. From the inside, the employees watched and understood. The veterans, the ones who had worked under Benny, who remembered Jack's presidency as the gold standard of how the place should be run, could feel what was happening. Nolan Dalla, who served as the Horseshoe's director of public relations during the final years, sat in the weekly executive meetings and watched. 20 people around a table arranged in a horseshoe shape, some of them among the best casino professionals in the business, some of them hired because they worked cheap, all of them making their reports to management, and none of them able to stop what was coming. The WSOP, meanwhile, had become something the building couldn't contain. In 2003, a recreational poker player named Chris Moneymaker won the main event at Binion's. He had qualified through an $86 online satellite tournament. He beat professional players. He won $2.5 million. ESPN covered it with a new whole card camera that let viewers see every hand. The broadcast reached millions of people who had never thought about poker and suddenly couldn't stop thinking about it. The moneymaker effect was real, and it was immediate. The poker boom that followed sent hundreds of players to a room built for dozens. The Horseshoe's poker room, the home of the World Series of Poker for 34 consecutive years, was physically too small, too old, too cramped to accommodate the event that the Horseshoe itself had created. Jack Binion's separate Horseshoe Gaming Holding Corporation, the out-of-state empire he had built after his Las Vegas buyout, had also, by this point, been sold to Harrah's Entertainment for $1.45 billion. While the original Horseshoe was failing to make its pension payments, the brand that had spun off from it sold for nearly $1.5 billion. Inside the Fremont Street building, Becky Binion had stopped making contributions to the Culinary Union's pension and welfare funds in June 2003. The trustees gave her extensions, then more extensions. She promised new loans were coming. They did not come. The employees whose benefits were going unpaid, the dealers and pit bosses and cooks and cocktail waitresses, kept showing up for work. They didn't know. By December 2003, the trustees had run out of extensions to give. Nolan Dalla's last official day as Director of Public Relations for Binion's Horseshoe was December 26, 2003. The week before Christmas, the casino had managed one final blaze of relevance: the National Finals Rodeo, Benny's Rodeo, the event he had helped bring to Las Vegas, the annual December influx of cowboys that had always been the Horseshoe's natural constituency, came to town, and Dalla had convinced management to try something desperate and brilliant. They removed a third of the slot machines from the casino floor, installed a dance floor the size of a full basketball court, built a stage with lights and a sound system, found a country western band, lit candles on 62 tables around the perimeter. For the duration of the rodeo, Binion's Horseshoe became something it had never been in 52 years of operation. A country western dance hall. It worked. Gaming revenue went up. The bars ran over. The poker room, riding the moneymaker wave, was packed every night. Even the barbecue turned a profit. The cowboys loved it. The energy in the building, for those 2 weeks, was the closest thing to its old self that the Horseshoe had managed in years. This was the last rodeo, Dalla wrote later, and he meant it literally. The cowboys left. December deepened. The Christmas crowds that a healthy casino might have expected did not materialize. The Death Watch atmosphere returned, worse than before. Executives knew something was wrong. The word coming from ownership was that new financing was imminent. It was always imminent. Dalla left on December 26th. 14 days later, January 9th, 2004, a group of armed U.S. Marshals walked through the front entrance of Binion's Horseshoe Casino on Fremont Street. They went straight to the casino cage. They presented court orders, authorizing them to seize nearly $1.9 million in cash, the money owed to the culinary union's pension and welfare funds that Becky Binion had been promising to pay since June. Under Nevada gaming regulations, a casino must maintain a certain bankroll in its cage to cover player winnings. The marshals took the money. The cage was empty. Gaming operations ceased immediately. Federal marshals and agents from the Nevada Gaming Control Board were the Horseshoe's last guests. The casino, which had run continuously for 52 years, through gangsters and federal investigations and family warfare and the transformation of Las Vegas from a highway town into a global entertainment industry, went dark. More than 800 employees found out what had happened the same way the rest of Las Vegas did. The marshals walked in, the cage was empty, and the doors were locked. No severance packages had been arranged, no transition plan. The people who had given decades to the Horseshoe, who had been Horseshoe people, with everything that carried, were suddenly simply out of work, with their pension funds underfunded and their employer on its way to federal court. They tried to find work in the casino industry. Many of them discovered that former Horseshoe employee was not the credential it had once been. The Horseshoe's reputation for running at the edges of what corporate Las Vegas considered acceptable, for being, in the parlance of the new casino order, a fuck house, a place with its own rules and its own culture and its own way of doing things, had seeped into how the industry saw its workers. They were marked by where they'd been. One of them, years later, put it in terms that landed, "We weren't black sheep, we were child molesters. No one wanted anything to do with us." And then there was Ted. Ted Binion had been dead since September 17th, 1998. 5 years before the marshals walked through the door. But his death was present in everything that followed, a ghost haunting the decade of decline. He had been found on the floor of his home at 2408 Palomino Lane, lying on a yoga mat in the den, an empty bottle of Xanax beside him. His girlfriend, Sandy Murphy, called 911. She said, "My husband has stopped breathing." Murphy was 26 years old. She had met Ted at Cheetah's, a topless club, in 1994. He had moved her into his 8,500 square foot home, given her a Mercedes, a credit card, an allowance. She was, by most accounts, the center of his life during his most desperate years. The period when the Gaming Commission was closing in, when the heroin use was accelerating, when the man who had once been the soul of the Horseshoe's casino floor had been reduced to watching the casino through security cameras from outside the building. The drugs in Ted's body when he died, heroin, Xanax, Valium, the levels were lethal, but the distribution was wrong. An addict who smoked tar heroin, as Ted did, chasing the dragon, inhaling the smoke, would have narcotics distributed through his bloodstream. Ted's drugs were concentrated in his stomach, like someone had made him swallow them, like someone had given them to him in a glass. His sister Becky, when she heard, said, "Ted would never take his own life." She was right that it wasn't suicide. What it was, murder, or the most precisely self-destructive accident of a man who had spent 20 years moving in that direction, is the question that a Las Vegas jury eventually refused to answer. 2 days after Ted died, Nye County Sheriff's deputies found Rick Tabish in the Pahrump Desert at midnight, with large trucks and bright construction lights, excavating a 12-foot-deep concrete vault from the desert floor. Inside, 46,000 pounds of silver bars and coins, paper currency, Horseshoe casino chips, the Binion hoard, 6 tons of it, estimated at between $7 million and $14 million. Ted's entire personal fortune, buried in a vault that only he and Tabish knew about. Tabish was a Montana contractor Ted had met, improbably, in a Las Vegas motel bathroom. He had helped build the vault. He claimed Ted had told him to protect the silver for his daughter Bonnie if anything ever happened. Investigators found that Tabish and Sandy Murphy had been having an affair. They found that the day before he died, Ted had called his attorney to have Murphy cut from his will. They found that Murphy had been captured on video removing items from the home the day after Ted's death, including, allegedly, a wine glass used to deliver a cocktail of heroin, Xanax, and Valium. The glass was never found. In June 1999, Murphy and Tabish were arrested for first-degree murder. The prosecution's theory: they had drugged Ted into unconsciousness and then suffocated him, one covering his nose and mouth, the other sitting on his chest, because the drugs were taking too long and they were afraid of being discovered. A forensic pathologist named Michael Baden testified to small red lesions on Ted's chest, consistent with compression. He called the technique Burking, after William Burke, a 19th-century murderer who had invented it. The trial ran for 7 weeks in the spring of 2000. The courtroom was packed every day. National television covered it. Former District Attorney David Roger, who prosecuted the case: "People were riveted because you had drugs, sex, betrayal, buried treasure, old Las Vegas history." In May 2000, after 68 hours of deliberation, the jury found them guilty. Tabish received 25 years to life. Murphy received 22. 3 years later, the Nevada Supreme Court overturned the convictions on a procedural technicality. Tabish should have had a separate trial on an unrelated extortion charge. At the second trial, in the fall of 2004, both were acquitted of murder. They had stolen the silver. That much was established at both trials. They were convicted of burglary and grand larceny. What they did or didn't do to Ted Binion on September 17, 1998, the law ultimately declined to say. Sandy Murphy is now married to an art dealer. She lives in Laguna Beach. Rick Tabish lives in Montana and runs a cryptocurrency company. Ted Binion's daughter Bonnie received her father's silver. Ted Binion's death, whether it was murder or the culmination of 20 years of self-destruction, or some terrible convergence of both, has never been officially resolved. It probably never will be. January 23, 2004, 14 days after the marshals walked in, Becky Binion reached a deal to sell Binion's Horseshoe to Harrah's Entertainment. The price, approximately $50 million. At the same time, almost exactly the same time, Harrah's was finalizing a separate deal to acquire Jack Binion's Horseshoe Gaming Holding Corporation, the out-of-state chain Jack had built after his buyout from the Las Vegas property. The price for that deal, $1.45 billion. The brand that spun off from the original sold for 29 times what the original fetched. Harrah's retained the Horseshoe name and the World Series of Poker rights, sold the physical building and the Binion's name to a West Virginia company called MTR Gaming Group. On March 11, 2004, the sale was final. After 53 years, there was no Binion running Binion's. MTR Gaming reopened the casino on April 1, 2004. The duct-taped carpet was gone. 1/3 of the slot machines had been removed. The employees were being paid. Mayor Oscar Goodman, defense attorney to the mob, friend of Ted Binion, a Las Vegas original, presided over the reopening ceremony. The World Series of Poker had moved to the Rio Hotel and Casino, just west of the Strip. It hosted the 35th annual series in the summer of 2004 in a convention center with space for hundreds of tables. It never came back to Binion's. The last WSOP final table at Binion's happened in July of 2005, a ceremonial gesture. The final 3 tables of the main event played in the original room as a goodbye. A man named Joe Hackham raised his bracelet in the room where it all began, in front of the gallery of champions on the wall. Then the lights went off and the tournament went somewhere else and didn't come back. In 2008, TLC Casino Enterprises bought the property from MTR, no Binion involvement. In December 2009, the hotel, 366 rooms, the structure that had been the Mint Tower before the 1988 acquisition, closed permanently. Asbestos in the walls. The cost of removal was prohibitive. Plans for renovation were shelved. The building sat on Fremont Street, among the light show and the kiosks and the rotating bar called Whiskey Liquor Up Saloon, which features floor-to-ceiling retractable windows that bring the excitement of the Fremont Street experience indoors, and which would have made Benny Binion spit on the floor with feeling. In 2019, 81 of the hotel rooms were reopened as the Hotel Apache. Boutique rooms, vintage-style furnishings reminiscent of the original Hotel Apache that opened in 1932. The guests who stay there sometimes report unusual sounds at night, unexplained presences, the sense that the building is occupied by something they can't see. The hotel markets this enthusiastically. In August 2024, 20 years after the family lost it, Caesars Entertainment sold the World Series of Poker brand to GG Poker's parent company for $500 million. The asset that Benny Binion created in 1970 with 7 players in a low-ceilinged room. The thing he built from nothing. The event that was almost an afterthought when Harrah's bought the original building in 2004, sold in 2024 for 10 times what the building itself fetched. Sold to a company with no office in downtown Las Vegas, with no connection to the Binion name, with no particular reason to remember where it came from. There is a museum in Las Vegas where the old signs go. The Neon Museum on Las Vegas Boulevard North collects the signs of the city's past, the marquees and the neon tubes, and the backlit letters from the hotels and casinos that no longer exist. The Stardust is there, the Sands, the Moulin Rouge, in what the museum calls the Boneyard, the main outdoor collection, open to the sky. The signs are arranged in the Nevada air, unlit, their colors still present but not glowing, their electricity gone. The Binion's Horseshoe sign is there, the original neon horseshoe that used to blaze above the entrance on Fremont Street, that used to turn the block gold, that pilots could navigate by, that every serious gambler in America knew as the signal that they had arrived at the right place, sits in the Boneyard now, propped against the desert air among the other relics of what Las Vegas used to be. It has not been lit in years. On a quiet morning in Las Vegas, before the Fremont Street experience has warmed up its LED array and the tourists have arrived with their cameras and their cups of frozen cocktails, you can stand on the block where the Horseshoe used to be and listen to what's there now. The mechanical whir of slot machines calibrated to a yield percentage calculated in a corporate office somewhere. The piped music from the Whiskey Liquor Up Saloon, which is not yet open. The particular silence of a room that was built to make noise, running on ambient sound. What's missing is not loud. It never is, when something genuine has been replaced by something approximate.